So hi again, everybody. I'm Beth Rebay, the director of the Civics Project, and your host today, and also the director of Repair, which sponsors the Civics Project. And I'm joined today by my 13-year-old goddaughter, Naomi Cross, and really excited to have her with me to talk about standardized testing. Repair is based in Los Angeles. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement from LA, but then ask Naomi to tell us a little bit about the land where we are today. So Repair acknowledges the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Tarahatone, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukkvatan, the ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, and Eohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. So I wanted to ask my goddaughter Naomi to tell us where we are right now.
So right now, we're in the unceded territory of Lenape. It's also known as Lenape-Hoking, the Hudson River Valley.
Okay, thank you. And as noted, we're going to be talking about standardized testing today. So I'm going to have a few questions for Naomi since she's being subjected to a lot of it as an 8th grader, but we'll proceed from here. And Naomi, actually, you taught me when standardized testing was first invented. Where was that?
So about 2,000 years ago in China, standardized testing had first been invented.
Okay, quite a while ago. I wouldn't have guessed standardized tests were 2,000 years old. So in the United States, schools initially in the colonial and revolutionary periods were for wealthy people to send their children to. It wasn't something that most people got to do. And it was around the 1840s, about a generation before the Civil War, that policymakers and states started to decide to try to educate a wider mass of people. I wouldn't say everybody, because there wasn't a presumption that public education would be available to people of color, but to start to take a wider range of white people, not just the wealthy, into schools. And in that same time period, examinations, when schools were just for wealthy white kids, you had mostly oral examinations. So as schools started to be for a wider range of people, schools also started to move from oral to written testing. And in the pre-Civil War period, schools started to have mandatory written exams. And after that, in the post-Civil War period, we just saw the, very wide expansion of a whole range of new testing instruments measuring whether students were prepared for college, their supposed intelligence or mental ability. And then in 1890, Harvard President Charles William Eliot proposed having common entrance exams for colleges. And then in 1900, the college entrance examination was formed. And in 1901, they had the first exams around the country in 9 subjects that were, again, geared towards assessing whether students were ready to start college. So over the next 30 years, you see the introduction of 1,300 different achievement tests entering the market, as well as 400 different tests that measured intelligence or mental capacity, 92 different high school tests, vocational tests, and even tests assessing athletic ability. And you started to see more state-level testing programs becoming mainstreamed. By World War I, the military was starting to use standardized testing, particularly what was known as the Army Mental Test. In 1922, you started to see more widespread critiques of standardized testing emerging. One of them was from a fairly prominent philosopher named John Dewey. Do you know who he was? Had you heard of him before?
I heard of him when we were researching it, but before that, previously, not really.
Okay, gotcha. But Dewey was quite well known, and he was quoted as saying our mechanical, industrialized civilization is concerned with averages, with percents, and he specifically said, the mental habit which reflects this social scene subordinates education to social arrangements based on averaged gross inferiorities and superiorities. So he's really critiquing this idea of like you pass or you fail, instead of dealing with the complexity and subjectivity of education. And then in 1923, Carl Brigham published a book called The Study of American Intelligence, and he was a eugenicist. So one of the things that he was writing was that African Americans were, according to Brigham, on the low end of achievement and possibility relative to pretty much anything that you could think of, intelligence and character. and he proposed that standardized testing would prove the superiority of, quote, the Nordic race group, close quote. He was also crusading pretty loudly against, quote, promiscuous intermingling, close quote, of new immigrants in the U.S. gene pool. What do you think of Brigham?
I think that he needs to put on some big boy pants and realize that that's not science, that's just racism.
Well put, Naomi. Okay, so Brigham, I agree with Naomi's assessment. He had a lot of credibility at the time, and he consulted with the military in the development of their standardized tests, and also was very influential in the development of the scholastic aptitude tests, the SATs, which were introduced in 1926 and first administered, again, in part under Brigham's guidance and influence. And then in 1929, we saw the introduction of what are known as the Iowa assessments. They were developed at the University of Iowa, and they were the first major standardized test program for high school students. And within a year, by 1930, multiple choice testing became really entrenched. It doesn't mean that there was no resistance. Critics were saying like these multiple choice tests encouraged memorization rather than deeper learning and complex cognition, and encouraged guessing rather than true study. But its defenders, were very much, I think, entrenched in the thinking of the Industrial Revolution. And they said standardized tests are more efficient and they're supposedly objective. They imagined that standardized tests would be free from bias since everyone was taking the same test. And so by 1936, that multiple states had already adopted the Iowa assessments, and it became rapidly the way in which high school students were tested. Something else happened right around that era. So in 1935, you started to see high-speed computing emerging as a way that you could process a lot of electronic data, allowing a computer to move, to more rapidly process rapid numbers of tests. And in 1936, automatic test scanning equipment was developed and introduced and reproduced pretty quickly. So that's pretty much the time period right before World War II, where you start to see multiple choice testing, test scanning equipment, all this computerized process that became the Scantrons we know and love or hate today. And, over the next 20 years, that became sort of how they assessed people. And in the 1960s, Congress passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This was specifically 1965. And this prompted even more testing based on, these congressionally imposed norms or ideas about how students should be able to perform. And today we know there's so many different standardized tests students are subjected to. And, in some cases can use to opt out of introductory college classes like advanced placement tests. Now, Naomi, you're in 8th grade. How many standardized tests would you say you've taken?
Well, I would say since kindergarten around 30, I took about 3 a year from kindergarten to 5th grade. And I took about, I'd say 3 or 4 in 6th grade. 7th grade, I missed a few from COVID, but this year I am supposed to go around 4 or 5 tests this year, I think. So just around 30 tests.
That's a lot. Do you feel stressed out by them? Do you do okay with them?
I'm pretty stressed out by them, and it's pretty difficult, especially when we used to do PARC, which was before which was before the NJSLA, and there was a few hundred questions.
Lots of names and acronyms. Mm-hmm.
I just call it the NJSLA to make it a little bit easier.
Okay.
But there's so many questions in it, and like for the ELA test, there was like 200 questions, but not like simple questions. You used to have to read articles and then write like multiple paragraph answers, and it was very difficult, and it took many days, and it was incredibly stressful to sit down for that long.
They were testing. You would test for days as a kid under 13. That's a lot. That's a lot to ask of younger children. So in the contemporary era, there's a few things we should talk about in terms of policy. Now, I know you've heard of No Child Left Behind, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, so No Child Left Behind was introduced by George W. Bush in 2001. And it was a piece of legislation, and its stated purpose was to make sure that school standards through standardized tests ensured that every kid was getting a decent education. So that was on the face what the act was calling for. But what it actually didn't work the way it claimed to, that it claimed its purpose essentially. So No Child Left Behind had a lot of standardized testing requirements for any school receiving federal funding, which is most schools, all the public ones, and a lot of the private ones too. And it basically said,
In certain programs.
if not enough of the kids were doing well on the standardized tests, then the schools would be penalized by losing some of their federal funding. So we can imagine why that would be really problematic, because if you've got a school that's already pretty poor, that doesn't have a lot of money, and is already struggling to educate the kids, and your punishment for the fact that they're falling behind is to take away more of their money, right? You can imagine where that would go wrong. Now, this obviously was passed well before you were in school or born, right? 2001. That's a long time ago. 20 years. So when you're 13, that's a very long time ago, right? One of the things we saw happen because of No Child Left Behind, though, was that schools actually started to be so panicked about losing their funding that they were trying to get rid of students who were testing poorly. So we saw that students with disabilities, those who were doing particularly poorly on standardized tests, and particularly students of color with disabilities, started to be suspended or expelled so that schools could get them off of the rosters and not have to include them in their testing processes. And this was really damaging because not only were those kids then not getting their education, but not only were their needs not being addressed, but a lot of those kids wound up being incarcerated, because when kids aren't in school or when they're getting really alienated from their education, they're more likely to wind up in the juvenile justice system. So it was around this time when we really started hearing folks talk about the school to prison pipeline, and No Child Left Behind was at least a part of that landscape. And we can think about things getting better, and clearly not enough, Naomi, if you're having to be standardized tested for days, right? But there is some good news. One is the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was passed in 2015, and it's intentionally trying to start to reduce standardized testing requirements and to separate it from the process of education.
Maybe once I get to high school, I won't have to take pre-tests, midterms, end tests, and then the NJSLI.
That's a lot. It would be nice if that were true by the time you get to high school, but since that's next year, I'm not going to assume we'll quite be there yet. Still a ways to go. So I'm sorry, my dear, but you may have several more years of standardized tests ahead. One good piece of news, though, is that a number of colleges are now making the SATs and the ACTs to the major college standardized tests optional. So students can submit their test scores, but it's no longer required for college admission at more campuses around the country. So that's one thing that can work. But one question people often ask is, like, how does testing bias even work? So, we know that Carl Brigham and a lot of his supporters were bent on using standardized tests to prove the superiority of the white race. And we also know that there are test performance differentials that break down and seem to particularly disfavor Black and Latinx and Indigenous students. But why, right? If everybody's receiving the same paper test, what's going wrong? So one of the things that we know, and we have to think about this because we want to be able to answer test makers who claim that a test is an objective instrument. So what we've learned is that tests basically measure the extent to which students have had exposure to more educational resources and attention. And that a lot of those resources and attentions, student-teacher ratio, availability of more complex and challenging classes, are often systematically either unavailable or less available, or don't have enough supplies, or materials, are under-resourced for schools that predominantly serve working class and poor youth of color. So testing tends to measure the extent to which students get a lot of access to resources and active teaching and engagement. But part of the problem is it keeps being treated as a measure of intelligence or ability. So it's actually measuring inequality to the extent that it's measuring anything, but it gets confused with intelligence and your capability to learn and to perform. So I know we've talked about how many tests that you've taken. Would you say that you're in favor of getting rid of most standardized testing?
Yes, I would say that most standardized testing doesn't serve a large enough purpose and is just not worth the effort. I propose an idea in which you have educational specialists come to schools and have a one-on-one flexible chat with the students. An example I can give of how this would work better is if you had a solid wooden ruler and you were trying to measure the circumference of a circle, you'd have a very difficult time because you weren't able to wrap the ruler around the circle. But if you had a flexible ruler that was able to modify to the shape of that circle, you could better measure the circumference of the circle. And it's the same thing with students because some students have issues with reading and wording. Some students aren't able to read as well. Some students have a hard time breaking down questions or need help in some subjects and not the others. Or sometimes kids get the answers that are close to right, but not quite right, but it'll just be registered as wrong throughout the test because it's so computerized. And I think it's much better to have a one-on-one flexible talk with a educational specialist.
All right, well, you've got me persuaded, Naomi. And I have to say something's going right in your education because that was a pretty great analogy. Let's think about, well, how are we going to know how schools are doing if we're not using standardized testing? Do you think those individual assessments would do the job?
Yes, you could also have teacher evaluations from other schools to make it a little less biased, to check up on the classroom and, of course, see if the kids got most of the subjects down, where they need improving, and overall grades might play a little bit of a role into that as well.
Yeah, one of the things I think you were telling me when we were preparing for this last night is that there's a lot of data that's saying that grades are actually a better predictor than standardized tests of how students, particularly students of color, are going to do in college, right? Because tests are often capturing educational inequities, but students who are getting good grades are also, once they adjust and catch up to the deficiencies in their K-12 education, like by their second year of college, likely to get good grades in college too. Does that fit it? Did I get it right, what you were teaching me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm glad I listened. So we have a book recommendation for you this week, and it's called Multiplication is for White People, Raising Expectations for Other People's Children. And this is a book by Lisa Delpit, and she's tackling some of the ways that students of color are having a tough time in the classroom because they're encountering school administrators and teachers who underestimate them, right? Who assume they're not going to be able to do things. So that's our suggestion for those who would like to do more learning. We'll have some time for a chat with our Zoom audience in a moment. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Usually we announce our next episode, but I wanted Naomi's opinion. So we're going to talk tonight about what we should have the Civics Project do for the next couple weeks. But we will be back on the 12th and the 19th of December, and we'll take a break on the 26th, and we'll let you know what we have in mind for January. Thank you so much, everybody who tuned in today. And again, Zoom audience, please feel free to hang out for a few more minutes if you'd like to talk or ask questions. And yes, folks are asking for the book recommendation in the chat, and we will post that. All right, Naomi, any last thoughts for us?
Not necessarily. The second the Zoom meeting is going to end, I'm going to think of like $1 billion, but as for now, I have nothing.
I know, isn't that the way the recording ends and you remember all the other things that you wanted to say? Okay, so again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and stay tuned to our Eventbrite registration page to see what's coming up for the rest of the month. Take care. Want to wave? Okay, bye-bye.